Welcome to the silence they feared, the storm they tried to ignore. This is not a speech, it's a mirror. And in that reflection, you'll see every moment you were counted out, laughed at, overlooked, misunderstood, and dismissed as nothing more than noise. You were never the flame they thought would die. You were the heat they never trained for. Today, we don't speak to the version of you that wanted to be liked. We speak to the version that outlasted the smoke, that didn't set fire to fools, just let them combust on their own ignorance. Let that sink in. You didn't burn them. You left them smoking from their own stupidity. They underestimated you. That was their first mistake. The second was thinking you needed them to breathe. And the third, believing you'd stay where they left you, quiet, small, doubting, breaking yourself down to make their shallow egos feel whole. But you didn't just survive, you watched, you observed, you gathered fuel. While they were busy mocking, you were busy building. While they threw shade, you learned to see in the dark. You became the storm they said didn't exist. No revenge, just results. No fire in your hands, just ashes at your feet. They thought your silence was surrender. It wasn't. It was calculation, precision, waiting for the moment they'd fall from their own ladders, reaching too high on delusions they never earned. And when they hit the ground, it wasn't your fire that burned them. It was their ego catching flame from friction. You didn't strike. You just stopped helping them carry the mask. That's the power of restraint, of letting go, not to fall, but to rise higher than they could ever reach. See, fire needs oxygen. And you stopped giving them your air. You walked away. You chose distance over drama, silence over screaming, growth over gossip. And they couldn't handle it, because the second you removed your light from their shadow, they had to face their own darkness. And it wasn't pretty. That's when they started choking on the smoke of their own choices. You didn't clap back. You didn't explain. You didn't try to fix what they broke. You just became undeniable. You became proof that you can't outtalk results, that clout can't match consistency, and that loud lies always collapse under the weight of quiet excellence. You didn't need to fight them. You just needed to become everything they said you couldn't, and more. Now they look confused, dazed, trying to rewrite the history they lived. You left them looking dumb as hell. Not because you embarrassed them, but because you exposed them. You didn't throw dirt. You just outgrew the grave they tried to bury you in. And that kind of glow, it can't be faked. It can't be borrowed. It can't be bought. It comes from one place, the pain you turned into power. They watched you bleed and thought you were done. They saw your wounds and thought they'd won. But healing? Healing was your revenge. Not loud, not flashy, just quiet scars turned into armor. And now, you don't flinch, you don't beg, you don't explain your worth to people who couldn't see it, even when it was standing right in front of them. You just let them fumble their own illusions. They thought they were the sun. You showed them you were the galaxy. Bigger, broader, built from light they couldn't even understand. You didn't have to destroy them. You just had to evolve. And that's the kind of revenge no one sees coming. Not rage, not retaliation, just unshakable rise. You walked away and everything changed, because your power was never in fighting. It was in no longer needing to be understood by small minds. You stopped translating your soul into their broken language. You stopped dimming your frequency to match their noise. And when you did, their ignorance finally started to sound as hollow as it always was. They choked on it. because you didn't feed it. Your silence was the sound of elevation, and they hated it. Because the higher you climbed, the more ridiculous their ladder looked, built on gossip, envy, and fear. And you scaled mountains of your own making. You bled on every rock. You sweated on every ledge. And now, you're standing where they can't even breathe. They're not mad you burned them. They're mad they can't follow you anymore. That's what happens when the light they mocked becomes the standard they now chase. You were never the villain in their story. They just couldn't accept being the fool in yours. So they rewrote the ending, made you out to be the fire starter. But deep down, they know the truth. You didn't strike the match. You just stopped playing with wet wood. And now, they're sitting in the smoke, choking, confused, looking back and wondering when they lost control. But they never had it. They just assumed you'd always play small, that you'd keep carrying their comfort while shrinking your own purpose. But the day you stopped, the day you walked away from the noise, the drama, the blame, that was the day they started to burn. Not from your fire, from exposure. They were always their own downfall. You just stopped cushioning the fall. And the best part, you don't need to prove it. You don't need to show receipts. You don't need to clap back or clear the air, because results speak in silence, and yours are deafening. You left them looking dumb as hell, not because you tried to make them look that way, but because their own reflection finally stared back and told the truth. They laughed too early, celebrated too soon, forgot that the story doesn't end when you're counted out. It ends when you decide to count yourself in. And you did. You stepped into a version of you they didn't believe in. But now they have no choice but to watch. And that's not cruelty. That's clarity. That's what happens when the fire they feared wasn't in your hands, but in your heart. And it couldn't be put out. They called it luck. You called it work. They called it a phase. You called it purpose. They called it delusion. But you called it destiny. And when it arrived, it didn't need permission. It came with silence, with peace, with presence. And now, every room you enter, you don't have to speak. You don't have to prove. You don't have to shrink. They see it. You didn't burn them. You just stopped holding back. They talk now. A lot. About what you were, what you changed into, how you switched up. But they don't talk about what they did to deserve the silence. They don't talk about the mockery, the cold shoulders, the games, the fake love, the sabotage dressed up as advice. Because if they did, they'd have to admit it was never you who failed the connection. It was them who failed to recognize the rarity standing in front of them. They wore masks so long they forgot what truth looked like. And when you took yours off, when you chose authenticity over approval, they called it arrogance. They called it selfishness. But it wasn't any of that. It was freedom. The moment you finally understood that shrinking your light doesn't help anyone see better, it only blinds you. They tried to dim you because your glow revealed their cracks. They tried to silence you because your voice echoed the things they were too afraid to confront in themselves. And when you stopped shrinking, that's when they started choking. On jealousy, on regret, on the realization that they never really had you. They just had access to a version of you who hadn't awakened yet. And now that you're here, awakened, focused, sharp, they can't stand the sight of it. Because you didn't play the revenge game. You didn't beg for apologies. You didn't wait for closure from doors that were never meant to be reopened. You just leveled up so loud that it made their whispers sound like screams in their own head. That's what happens when truth walks in a room. It doesn't have to shout. It's felt. It's heavy. It's undeniable. And you became undeniable. Not because you were lucky, not because someone handed it to you, but because you stood in the fire and didn't flinch. Because you walked through rejection, through isolation, through betrayal, and didn't collapse. Because you looked in the mirror and said, I will become everything they said I couldn't, and more. And then you did. They thought it was over when they walked away. They thought you'd crumble. They thought their absence would paralyze you. But you were never standing because of them, and you didn't fall when they left, because your foundation was never built on their opinion. It was built on purpose, on pain turned into fuel, on vision that can't be dimmed by noise. And now that you've risen, they try to rewrite the narrative. They say they always believed in you, that they always saw your potential, that they were just waiting for you to grow. But they didn't believe. They doubted. They didn't support. They spectated. And when things got real, they weren't in your corner. They were in the crowd, watching, waiting, hoping to see a stumble, so they could finally feel tall standing in their own smallness. But you didn't stumble. You soared. And now, they're still stuck where you left them, not because you wished them harm, but because they refused to move forward. They clung to comfort, to ego, to laziness dressed up as confidence. You walked away from it all, not to be better than them, but to become better for you. And that decision, that silence, that refusal to play in the mud, that's what lit the match. You didn't set the fire. You became the standard. And they couldn't handle the reflection, because it showed them who they really were and who you've become. That image terrifies them, because it proves what's possible when someone stops seeking validation and starts building from within. When someone stops asking for a seat at the table and builds their own. And that's the difference. They were chasing acceptance. You were chasing alignment. Now, every time they see you, they remember the version of you they tried to erase, the one they tried to outshine, outtalk, outplay. But that version, that was your draft. And what you've become now, that's the published masterpiece. They're still editing their excuses while you're writing new chapters, still stuck in the past while you're outgrowing every version of yourself they thought they knew. You didn't burn them. You didn't plot. You didn't destroy. You left. And in your absence, everything false collapsed. Because the truth always wins. And you are walking, breathing, unstoppable proof of that. No applause needed, no validation required. Just the echo of your footsteps walking away, and the smoke left behind as their excuses caught fire. And now they're choking on the realization. You didn't betray them. You just stopped betraying yourself. They thought they had you figured out, like you were predictable, like you'd stay in the box they built for you, the quiet one, the nice one, the humble one who wouldn't dare outshine them. But humility doesn't mean shrinking. Kindness doesn't mean weakness. And silence, it doesn't mean surrender. It means you were learning, calculating, becoming. You were storing energy while they were wasting theirs talking. You were building in the dark while they were performing in the light. And when your time came, you didn't announce it. You didn't scream. You didn't come back with noise. You came back with evidence, with execution, with proof that you can't stop someone who decided that they don't need permission anymore. Because what they never understood is that power doesn't always enter the room loud. Sometimes it walks in quietly and changes everything without touching a single thing. That's what you did. You changed everything by refusing to play small, by finally realizing you never owed anyone comfort at the cost of your own capacity. You never owed anyone explanation for growth they refused to chase for themselves. They called it betrayal when you chose yourself. They called it arrogance when you stopped accepting breadcrumbs. They called it pride when you demanded peace over performance. But it wasn't any of that. It was awakening. And when you awaken, the ones still dreaming will always feel exposed. That's why they talk. That's why they spiral. That's why they whisper your name now in rooms they never invited you into before. Because now, you're not knocking, you're not asking, you're becoming. And the more you become, the more they unravel. Because you didn't just rise, you rose with grace. No revenge, no bitterness, just absence, just boundaries, just a refusal to go back to places where you were never seen clearly. You didn't burn the bridge, you just stopped painting it. You let the cracks show. You let them trip over the games they built. You let them sit in the smoke of their own carelessness. And the silence you left behind spoke louder than any argument ever could. And now they're confused. They don't know how to reach you anymore, because you're not who you were. You don't speak the same. You don't move the same. You're focused now, intentional. You walk like someone who knows what they carry. And that kind of self-awareness terrifies people who only know how to manipulate confusion. But you're not confused anymore. You're not searching anymore. You're not bending for peace that costs your soul anymore. And that's what scares them. Because the version of you they could control, that version is gone, buried, transformed, replaced with someone who doesn't flinch when doubted, doesn't chase after temporary affection, and doesn't entertain chaos disguised as connection. You outgrew them, and they felt it before they understood it. That's why they act strange now. That's why the tone shifts. Why the energy feels off. Because somewhere deep down, they know they had front row seats to something rare, and they wasted it. They tried to dim it. They tried to mock it. They tried to contain something that was never meant to fit inside their insecurities. And now, they sit in the smoke of what they destroyed. Not because you destroyed it, but because they never knew how to tend to a real flame. They played with fire thinking it made them powerful. You became fire by learning how to endure it. And now they're coughing on the ashes of a connection they took for granted. Because you didn't just walk away. You walked up. You didn't just leave them behind. You leveled up so far they don't even recognize you anymore. And that's the point. The glow up wasn't just physical. It was spiritual, mental, emotional. It was years of silence turned into strength. Nights of tears turned into wisdom. Moments of breakdown turned into breakthrough. And every single scar, it glows now. You don't hide them, you wear them. Because they're proof, not of pain, but of the fact that nothing they did could stop the emergence of who you were always meant to be. And now they watch. They watch you become the thing they said you'd never be. The healed one, the focused one, the one who stopped explaining and started building, the one who stopped showing up for people who never learned how to value presence. And they looked dumb because they had access. They had your light. They had your loyalty. They had the most rare version of you, the unguarded, hopeful, giving version. And they lost it because they thought you'd never leave. They thought you'd always come back. They thought their patterns would keep working. But you don't react anymore. You don't dance to the chaos anymore. You don't lower yourself to remind people how high you've come. You just stay focused, stay grounded, stay aligned. And in that stillness, they burn. Not because you set the fire, but because they never thought your silence would be this loud. And now, they're choking on every version of you they didn't believe in. And here's the irony. They still watch, quietly, closely, secretly hoping you fall. Not because they hate you, but because your rise forces them to face everything they've refused to fix in themselves. Your growth is an unspoken reminder that they had the same hours in the day, the same chances, the same starting point, but they spent their energy tearing others down while you were building brick by brick in silence. And now, the structure you've built blocks out their opinions like sunlight through blackout curtains. They can't touch you anymore, not because you're untouchable, but because you're unreachable. You've elevated your mind, your spirit, your standards. They've shifted beyond what they can fake their way into. They wore confidence like a costume. You bled for yours. They performed. You became. That's why they burn now, because for the first time, they're forced to sit with the fact that they played a role in losing you, that the weight they thought you couldn't carry, you carried alone, that the voice they tried to drown became your anthem, that the light they tried to outshine now guides others. And you never needed revenge. You never needed to destroy anyone. You never had to be cruel. All you had to do was move on. And that is the loudest silence the universe can deliver. Because while they stayed stuck rehearsing the same ego games, you were outgrowing every conversation they tried to pull you into. While they were gossiping, you were grinding. While they were plotting, you were praying. While they were hoping you'd break, you were breaking cycles instead. Now they're left staring at your success with the stunned expression of someone who never believed the tree would grow, and now finds themselves standing in its shade. They're coughing on the smoke of their own disbelief. They didn't think the quiet one would rise. They didn't think the underestimated one would lead. They didn't think the one they ignored, dismissed, criticized would become the proof that pressure builds diamonds when it doesn't break you. But you didn't just rise. You rose with purpose. You rose with scars that taught you how to protect your peace, with boundaries that don't bend, with a mindset that doesn't beg to be seen anymore because it knows exactly who it is and where it's going. And now, you're untouchable. Not because you're perfect, but because you're rooted, unshakable, clear. And they don't know what to do with that version of you, the version that doesn't entertain the noise anymore, the version that doesn't correct lies because truth doesn't panic, the version that doesn't explain absence to people who never noticed your presence in the first place. You're not bitter, you're just unavailable. You're not angry, you're just elevated. And that kind of peace, that kind of power, it haunts people who tried to weaponize your vulnerability. Because you were once open, once soft, once giving without limits, and they mistook that for weakness. They thought they could mold you, manage you, drain you, but all they did was teach you the value of solitude, of protecting your energy like it's gold, because it is, of understanding that not everyone who claps is cheering, and not everyone who's around is loyal. You learned, you watched, you adapted, and now they sit in confusion, wondering why the same manipulations no longer work, why their silence doesn't scare you, why their distance feels like relief instead of punishment. It's because you've evolved. You're not the fire anymore. You're the furnace that refines. And while they stay stuck in loops of their own making, you're not even looking back. You don't need closure from people who were never open in the first place. You don't need clarity from those who spoke in riddles. You don't need love from people who only knew how to take. You don't burn bridges anymore. You build boundaries, and you enforce them with silence.